Guantanamo is a real issue for the United States, and it's a part of our standing in the world, but it's not 80% of the reality of American life. And people do have a sense of what that whole range of American life might be, from movies and TV and travel in the US. There's not yet as much of that from China. So to wrap up this first very long point, I am impressed at the importance and need for firsthand exposure of the kind that you provide the school through the Zeidman program. And it has been an issue in how China has dealt with the outside world and how the US understands this, its engagement with China. The second institutional point I'd like to raise involves the state, the government, by which I mean, is something changing in the relationship between China and the United States. Over the last 6 months, there have been a lot of ominous sounding headlines and news reports about the perhaps mixed reaction that President Obama might or might not have gotten when he was visiting last fall, and the misunderstandings or worse at Copenhagen, and disagreements about the RMB and its value, and the Google fight, and all the rest. And to me, the way of thinking about this is this exact question. Has something fundamental changed in the balance of the past 30 years? And let me explain what I mean, both by the balance and the potential change. It seems to me that in the years since 1979, when under Jimmy Carter, former president, relations were put on a different footing, when the Zeidman family made its first trip to China, that through most of that time, the premise between the US and China has been, number one, they have more areas where they can work together than work against each other. And number two, there's still some areas where they're going to work against each other, where they disagree. Number one is the economic integration, the sense of trying to have strategic understanding so they are not dealing with each other as military enemies, all the human exchanges, all the institutional connections. That's the area where most of the momentum for 30 years has been. And yet, the two countries disagree about Tibet, they disagree about Taiwan, they disagree about any number of political values, they disagree about certain international relations, and that's been it's not a tremendously complicated balance to understand, but it's a balance where mostly it's positive, but there's some negative too. So the question is, has it changed? Is the positive proportion ebbing below 50%? Is this becoming basically a challenging relationship where the US has to prepare, as some people already contend, for a showdown with China, for the next big enemy, etc.? Not to keep you in too much suspense, I'm going to argue no, it hasn't changed fundamentally, but let's just go through the logic of that for a moment. Let's think of the things that might have changed in a deep way that mean that the balance is no longer positive. The first of them would be on the economic symbiosis front, by which I mean that the development of the Chinese economy in its phenomenal scale over the last 30 years, I would argue has been obviously good for China, environmental complications, but good in lifting tens and perhaps hundreds of millions of people out of rural poverty, and either good or not damaging for the United States. We can go into the difference between those later on, but I would argue that in general, this has been a more symbiotic than it has been zero-sum economic relationship between the two. I tried to spend a lot of time in factories, et cetera, in China to trace this out. And the change on this front would be if it had become more head-to-head competition. If China's growth were coming more directly in areas that cut away from America's current employment base and more significantly its long-term development prospects. If China was developing industries that were directly threatening to America's future industries, et cetera, et cetera. I will simply assert and save for later questioning that we're not at that point at this moment. That the symbiotic relationship with some friction on both sides is basically in place. That there still is a situation where the manufacturing workforce and other problems in the United States are mainly internally generated, not mainly driven by China, but that would be one area you'd look at. And my reading of the evidence is it hasn't fundamentally changed. A second possible basic change would be in what you might call the economic balance of power. In a way, as you know, this is preposterous to think there could be an economic balance of power in which China was the boss and the U.S. was the underling or the serf, given that most people, and hundreds of millions of people in China, don't have indoor plumbing. The Chinese GDP has only recently passed that of Japan, or if it's passed at all, and Japan has 10 times, China has 10 times as many people as Japan, et cetera, et cetera. You know, just the conditions of life for so many people in China make it hard to seem that it could be the boss, but certainly the huge investment overhang of the trillions of dollars of dollar-denominated assets that Chinese institutions have, that might suggest, and is often portrayed in the U.S. press, a basic change in who is the master and who has to take orders. I would again assert that this also has not changed in its fundamentals, that it is unhealthy for both countries that their economies are as unbalanced as they are, that the U.S. has been as consumption heavy as it has been for the last 15 or 20 years, that China has been as skewed towards exports and overproduction as it has been. But that is bad for both of them, and in my view, each of them is dependent. The U.S. has been dependent on Chinese finance, but even more, China has been dependent on the U.S. as the repository of its investments. And there is just as much debate inside China now about whether their $1 trillion are safe here. Now, is this a reckless investment to put it in a depreciating currency with all these irresponsible bankers, et cetera? So it's more a balance of terror, I think, unhealthy on both sides, than it is a shift to a different boss relationship. But that would be another possibility. Another way in which you could argue that maybe something fundamental had changed would be simply in the psychological sense. If the U.S. was feeling so hang-dog, and the Chinese leaders were feeling so triumphalist that whether or not it was justified, they were acting like number one, and the U.S. was acting like acting as if it were no longer number one, and that this could have some bearing on their conduct of affairs. Certainly, there are signs and reports of Chinese negotiators and diplomats being unusually confident in these last 6 or 8 months. And certainly the problems of the U.S. financial system over the last 2 years and the U.S. political system in the last 6 or 8 months have given a sense around the world and in the U.S. of maybe the American model is under challenge and under question in various ways. My inference, however, my assumption is that the Chinese leaders are realistic enough and practical enough to know, number one, that triumphalism is bad politics, and also that it's not realistic at the moment, when they're dealing with a power that still is so much more dominant in various ways as the U.S., to my eye, still is for all of its problems. I have a long article in the last issue of the previous issue of The Atlantic. I have to avoid using terms like the last issue of The Atlantic, given the situation of the press. In the immediately past issue of The Atlantic, which has a 153-year heritage and will be here for another 153 years, I have a long article about whether really you could say the U.S. is going to hell in comparison with China or others. And I argue in most economic ways, in fact, it is prepared to be stronger over the next 10 or 15 years than many of their competitors. Politics is a different matter. But so this third area of possible fundamental change involves a sense of psychological shift. Certainly there's signs of confidence, but I think they are transitory rather than fundamental. Another possible sense of basic change would be the dawning of a different world order. The idea that just as Lee Kuan Yew used to say 20 years ago in Singapore, that the East Asian model had proved its sort of superiority and dominance over the Western model, whether there is the new Beijing consensus that will rule the world. And might this explain China's throwing its weight around on the Copenhagen talks or whatever? I'll again just assert, I don't think so. I think that while there have been a lot of interesting books with titles like When China Runs the World or Rules the World, I don't think it's a reasonable observation of reality now. Maybe 50 years from now, maybe 100 years from now, but it will have to be a very, very different China than the one we see now. Taking off a few other possible areas of real change, perhaps the emergence of cyber threats and actual attacks coming out of China on American interests might mean a new era of actual hostility. Here, my experience, and based on doing reporting for an Atlantic article, has been that yes, this is a problem, but it's neither mainly state controlled out of China nor coming mainly from China. That one of